For over a decade, the most dangerous man in the Western Hemisphere had no face. Law enforcement agencies from Washington, D.C. to Mexico City had his name on their walls, his file on their desks, and a $15 million U.S. bounty, matched by 300 million Mexican pesos, on his head. Yet almost no one alive could confirm what he looked like. The photographs that existed were decades old, grainy mugshots from 1986 and 1989, taken by the San Francisco Police Department when he was a teenager. He had become something more terrifying than a criminal. He had become a myth. His name was Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes. But the streets of Mexico, the corridors of the DEA, and the boardrooms of the FBI knew him by one name only, El Mencho. Born on July 17, 1966, in the rural community of Quilititlan in Aguililla, Michoacán, Nemesio entered the world in crushing poverty. His family cultivated avocados in the sun-scorched hills of western Mexico. He dropped out of primary school in the 5th grade. By age 14, he was already guarding marijuana plantations, not out of ambition, but because that was what survival looked like in Aguililla. He was known by many names throughout his life: Nemesio, Lorenzo Mendoza, Ruben Oseguera Cervantes. In the U.S., he moved under aliases including Ruben Avila, Jose Lopez Prieto, Miguel Valadez, and Carlos Hernandez Mendoza. The man had constructed a labyrinth of identities around himself long before he had anything to hide. In the 1980s, Nemesio made a decision that would eventually shake two nations. He crossed illegally into California. In 1986, he was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the San Francisco police arrested him at age 19 for stolen property and carrying a loaded gun. 2 months after that arrest, his first child was born. He was deported to Mexico and immediately came back. By the early 1990s, investigators believe he was already involved in methamphetamine production in Redwood City, working alongside his brother-in-law Abigail Gonzalez Valencia. In September 1992, federal agents set a trap. At a San Francisco bar called the Imperial, El Mencho and his older brother Abraham were arranging a heroin deal, 5 ounces for $9,500. But Nemesio, sharp as a blade even then, noticed something wrong. The undercover agents handed over perfectly stacked dollar bills instead of loose ones. He warned his brother. The police were listening through a wiretap. 3 weeks later, both men were arrested. In a stunning act of loyalty, Nemesio pleaded guilty to protect Abraham, knowing that if they went to trial, his brother's existing felony record would likely earn him life imprisonment. Nemesio was sentenced to 5 years at Big Spring Correctional Center in Texas. He served 3, was released on parole, and was deported to Mexico at age 30. Most men would have gone straight. Nemesio went into the police. For a brief, almost surreal chapter, he served as a local police officer in Cabo Corrientes and Tematlan, Jalisco, learning from the inside how Mexican law enforcement operated, where its weaknesses were, and how to exploit both. Then he left and joined organized crime full-time. To cement his position in the Milenio Cartel, he married strategically, taking Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, sister of the cartel's financial leadership, as his wife. The marriage was political as much as personal. He was building an empire. By 2009 to 2011, the Milenio Cartel had fractured. Its top leaders were dead or in prison. In the chaos, Nemesio made his defining move. He formed Los Mata Zetas, the Zeta Killers, won a brutal internal war, and renamed his organization the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The CJNG was born. Under El Mencho, the CJNG exploded. It shot down a military helicopter in 2015 using rocket-propelled grenades, a feat that stunned the Mexican government. It deployed drones carrying explosives. It laid landmines. It built a paramilitary wing. By 2019, the DEA estimated El Mencho had a net worth of at least $500 million, possibly over $1 billion. The U.S. government assessed the CJNG's total assets at $50 billion. And through all of it, 15 years of warfare, expansion, and blood, El Mencho remained invisible. No verified photographs, no public appearances, moving through the mountains of Jalisco like a ghost, protected by layers of lieutenants and the absolute terror his name inspired. But on a quiet Sunday morning in February 2026, in the mist-covered mountains of Tapalpa, Jalisco, a town so picturesque it attracts tourists, so remote it hides kings, the ghost finally bled. They had been hunting him longer than some soldiers had been alive. The pursuit of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was not a single mission or a sudden breakthrough. It was a grinding, decade-long intelligence war, fought through encrypted communications, satellite surveillance, and the slow, painful cultivation of informants deep inside one of the world's most paranoid criminal organizations. El Mencho never used the same phone twice. He never slept in the same location for more than a few nights. His inner circle was constructed on absolute loyalty, enforced by violence so extreme that potential informants chose death over the consequences of betrayal. People who talked simply disappeared. Bodies were found in states away from where victims were last seen, or never found at all. The DEA designated El Mencho their top global priority as early as 2019. By December 2024, the U.S. government raised his bounty from $10 million to $15 million, the highest reward ever offered for a living cartel figure. Kyle Morey, head of the DEA team assigned specifically to locate him, stated in interviews that El Mencho could be worth over $1 billion. He was not a criminal. He was a competing government. The U.S. had been building legal infrastructure around the CJNG for years. In 2015, the Treasury Department's OFAC sanctioned El Mencho under the Kingpin Act, freezing all his U.S.-based assets and prohibiting American citizens from doing business with him. Later sanctions targeted his inner circle, businesses in Jalisco, including a sushi restaurant in Puerto Vallarta, a tequila company, a rental cabin operation in Tapalpa, and agricultural fronts, all frozen. His brother Antonio, his son-in-law, 5 of his brother-in-law's siblings, all sanctioned. But sanctions were not enough to find a man who lived like a shadow. Then came Donald Trump's second term, and the equation changed fundamentally. In early 2025, the Trump administration formally designated the CJNG as a foreign terrorist organization and a specially designated global terrorist group. This was not symbolic. It was a legal declaration of war that unlocked new intelligence-sharing authorities, new military cooperation frameworks, and an entirely different level of pressure on the Mexican government to produce results. The message from Washington was explicit: deliver El Mencho or face consequences for Mexico. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum had long been publicly skeptical of the kingpin strategy, the approach of targeting individual leaders, which she argued simply created power vacuums and triggered succession wars more violent than what came before. But cornered between Washington's pressure and the undeniable reality that the CJNG was responsible for flooding American cities with fentanyl, she authorized a deeper military engagement. Sedena, the Secretaría de la Defensa Nacional, Mexico's military, deployed its most elite units to the El Mencho hunt. Intelligence sharing with U.S. agencies deepened to levels unprecedented in the bilateral relationship. Satellites were repositioned. Drone surveillance intensified over the mountains of southern Jalisco, Michoacán, Nayarit, and Colima, the regions where analysts believed El Mencho was hiding. There were near misses, safe houses where the coffee was still warm when soldiers arrived. There were locations El Mencho had departed just hours before. The ghost kept moving, but the intelligence was getting sharper with every month. The key breakthrough, the crack in 15 years of armor, came through an unexpected vulnerability. Mencho, 59 years old, and reportedly suffering from kidney disease, serious enough that he had built a private hospital in the village of Al-Sihuatl to treat himself, was not moving as freely as he once had, and a romantic partner, with whom he was spending time in a secluded rural compound in the Tapalpa highlands, had been unknowingly tracked. When U.S. and Mexican intelligence confirmed the location, the order was given immediately. The FEC, the Fuerza Especial Conjunta, Mexico's Joint Special Operations Command, was activated. The Mexican Air Force was put on standby for aerial surveillance and extraction. National Guard units were quietly deployed to seal off the surrounding perimeter in the Tapalpa Highlands, cutting off any escape through the mountain roads. On Saturday night, February 22, 2026, the operation was given the green light. They would move before dawn. No second chances. No warnings. This was the moment 15 years of intelligence work had been building toward. In Tapalpa that night, residents say it was quiet. The kind of mountain quiet that tourists love and locals barely notice anymore. The pine forests were dark. The cobblestone streets were empty. No one knew that in a compound somewhere in the wooded hills above the town, the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere was sleeping for the last time. Tapalpa is not the kind of place you expect to find the most wanted man on Earth. It is a colonial mountain town that tourists love. Cobblestone streets, whitewashed walls, red-tiled roofs nestled in pine forests at nearly 7,000 feet above sea level. The same Tapalpa that had once appeared on a U.S. Treasury Department sanctions list in 2015 because Mencho's CJNG operated a rental cabin business there, hiding in plain sight as always. But on Sunday, February 22, 2026, Tapalpa became the most consequential military battlefield in Mexico's modern history. Mexico's FEC Joint Special Operations Command moved before the town woke up. Elite soldiers, operating on pinpoint intelligence, converged on the rural compound in the wooded highlands where Mencho had been tracked. The Mexican Air Force provided aerial coordination. National Guard units sealed the mountain perimeter. Every road in and out of the target area was locked down. The operation was designed to capture him alive. The United States had multiple active federal indictments against Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, most recently unsealed in April 2022, charging him with conspiracy to manufacture and distribute methamphetamine, cocaine, and fentanyl in quantities that had poisoned American cities for years. Mexico had its own charges. Alive, Mencho was the most valuable intelligence asset in the hemisphere. Alive, he could give up supply chains, corrupt officials, financial networks, international partners. Mencho did not intend to be taken alive. The moment soldiers breached the perimeter of the compound, cartel gunmen opened up with military-grade weaponry, the same kind of high-caliber arsenal that the CJNG had spent 15 years accumulating and using to devastating effect against Mexican security forces. The firefight was ferocious. In the chaos, cartel fighters managed to strike a military helicopter, forcing it into an emergency landing in the nearby city of Sayula. 4 CJNG operatives were killed in the initial engagement. 3 Mexican soldiers were seriously wounded and had to be evacuated for emergency medical treatment. Then came the second confrontation. Mencho, wounded, had attempted to flee into the wooded undergrowth around the compound, the mountains he had known for decades, the terrain that had hidden him for 15 years. Soldiers pursued. In a second exchange of fire in the forest, Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, Mencho, 59 years old, sustained his fatal gunshot wounds. The ghost of Jalisco had been found hiding in the trees. He was critically wounded. He was still breathing, but barely. The Mexican army made the decision to airlift him to Mexico City immediately, along with 2 other critically wounded individuals from the compound. Armored vehicles were seized at the scene. Rocket launchers were cataloged. A massive cache of military-grade weapons was documented and removed. The evidence of what El Mencho had built, even in a single safe house, was staggering. He never reached Mexico City. Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes died en route. His wounds too severe, the distance too great. The 2 others wounded in the operation also died during the transfer. The Mexican Defense Ministry released an official confirmation within hours. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum appeared on national television, composed and steady. Peace and normalcy, she told the country, were being maintained. She praised the security forces. She called the operation a victory for the Mexican state. U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau called El Mencho one of the bloodiest and most ruthless drug kingpins, and declared it a great development for Mexico, the U.S., and the world. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt publicly confirmed that U.S. intelligence had supported the operation, an acknowledgement of how deeply the 2 nations had collaborated. In the pine forests above Tapalpa, the smoke drifted through the trees. The man who had once guarded marijuana fields at age 14, who had built a billion-dollar criminal empire, who had evaded 2 nations for 15 years, lay dead in the mountains of the state where he had made himself king. But in cartel compounds across 21 states, phones were already ringing, and what was coming next would bring Mexico to its knees. Within hours of El Mencho's death, Mexico exploded. What followed was not panic. It was not grief. It was a synchronized nationwide military response by a cartel that had spent 15 years building exactly for this moment. The CJNG did not mourn quietly. It sent a message to the Mexican government, to the United States, and to every rival cartel watching. We are still here, and this will cost you. Across 20 of Mexico's 32 states, CJNG cells activated simultaneously. Vehicles, cars, trucks, buses were hijacked at gunpoint and set ablaze. The burning hulks were positioned across highways, at intersections, on major access roads. Over 250 narco blockades materialized within hours, strangling movement across the country in an operation of military precision. This was not spontaneous. This had been planned and rehearsed. Ricardo Ruiz Velasco, known as LRR, commander of the CJNG's Internal Special Forces Unit, reportedly coordinated the retaliatory wave directly. Guadalajara, Mexico's second city, home to 5 million people, co-host city of the 2026 FIFA World Cup, became a ghost town. Residents locked themselves inside. Shopping malls closed. Traffic evaporated from streets that are normally gridlocked. Gunshots echoed through residential neighborhoods. CJNG cells moved systematically through the metropolitan area, burning vehicles and businesses as soldiers and civilians alike stayed indoors. Puerto Vallarta told the world's tourists, who were watching, exactly how bad it had gotten. American tourist Yoni Pizer was in a car with his husband and 2 friends, on their way to go whale watching, when a gunman appeared at their windshield with a weapon aimed directly at them, screaming for them to get out. Their vehicle was seized, torched, and used as a roadblock. Black smoke columns rose over the Pacific beachfront skyline. More than 10 vehicles and several businesses were set ablaze along streets that hours earlier had been full of vacationing families. Reports came in of prison disturbances and jailbreaks. In Michoacán, 13 municipalities reported simultaneous unrest. In Tamaulipas, Guanajuato, Nayarit, Colima, Guerrero, and Nuevo León, the reports were identical. Burning vehicles, armed checkpoints, gunfire. The CJNG had rehearsed this. Every regional commander knew his assignment. The cartel's decentralized structure, once seen as a vulnerability, had become its greatest strength in this moment of retaliation. The U.S. Embassy issued shelter-in-place orders for all government personnel in Guadalajara, Puerto Vallarta, and Cancun. The State Department issued urgent travel warnings across 5 major Mexican states. Airlines began monitoring Guadalajara's airport. World Cup organizers held emergency calls. The human cost was devastating. At least 25 members of Mexico's National Guard were killed in violence across Jalisco in the hours following the operation. In total, more than 34 cartel members were killed in clashes. Over 10,000 troops were deployed across Jalisco and neighboring states in an emergency security surge to prevent total collapse. The day after El Mencho died became one of the bloodiest single days in recent Mexican history. By Monday morning, Mexican forces had cleared most of the 250-plus blockades, a remarkable logistical achievement requiring simultaneous military and National Guard deployment across 20 states. But the scars were everywhere. Charred vehicle frames on highways, gutted storefronts, bullet holes in the walls of ordinary homes. The world watched and asked the question that Mexican security analysts had been debating for years. If killing the kingpin causes this much violence, was it worth it? President Sheinbaum had campaigned on rejecting the kingpin strategy, arguing that decapitating criminal organizations creates power vacuums that lead to even more devastating succession wars. El Chapo's arrest in 2016 had fractured the Sinaloa cartel into warring factions that killed thousands. Would El Mencho's death do the same to the CJNG? The answer was almost certainly yes. And as the fires burned across 20 states, the cartel commanders in their fortified ranches were already beginning to calculate. The morning after El Mencho's death, Mexico woke up to a country it barely recognized. The blockades had been cleared. The fires had been extinguished. President Sheinbaum appeared on national television, composed, calling for calm, declaring that normalcy was being restored. But behind the official calm, the most consequential succession crisis in the history of Mexican organized crime was already underway, and everyone involved knew it. Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes had built something unprecedented. Not just a cartel, a parallel state, operating across 21 Mexican states and maintaining supply networks in over 40 countries, from Colombia to China, from Australia to Europe and Africa. The CJNG had been responsible, per DEA estimates, for a significant portion of the fentanyl flooding into American cities, a drug that has killed more Americans than any war since Vietnam. Its total assets were assessed at $50 billion. One bullet does not kill that. The succession question was brutally complicated. El Mencho had separated from his wife, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, in 2018, and at the time of his death, he was involved with a different romantic partner, the very partner whose movements had led authorities to the Tapalpa compound. His son Ruben El Menchito had been convicted in September 2024 by a Washington, D.C. federal jury on murder, drug trafficking, and firearms charges, and sentenced to life in a U.S. prison. The direct line of succession was severed. Mexico City-based security consultant David Saucedo confirmed what intelligence analysts had feared. El Mencho's son being jailed in the United States had broken the cartel's succession structure. The most likely candidates to succeed him were Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, known as El Pelon or L03, El Mencho's stepson, and acknowledged de facto second-in-command, per the U.S. Director of National Intelligence's National Counterterrorism Center. But analysts noted El Pelon lacked significant influence among other cartel commanders, a critical weakness in a decentralized organization. Also positioned was Audia's Flora Silva, El Jardinero, a powerful regional commander controlling major trafficking corridors with his own dedicated paramilitary wing. Intelligence analysts believed El Jardinero might choose to break away entirely rather than serve under El Mencho's family. And Ricardo Ruiz Velasco, LRR, who had just demonstrated his operational capability by coordinating the national wave of retaliatory roadblocks within hours of El Mencho's death, commanded loyalty among the cartel's most militarized factions. El Mencho's brother Abraham, Don Rodo, regarded as a CJNG co-founder and vital to the cartel's money laundering and property operations, had been recaptured by Mexican authorities in February 2025 and remained in Mexican custody. His brother Antonio, El Tony Montana, the logistics operator arrested in December 2022, had been extradited to the United States in February 2025. The family structure that might have provided order was largely behind bars on two continents. Beyond Mexico's borders, the reverberations were immediate. In Ecuador, former Army Intelligence Chief Mario Pazmino warned that the Sinaloa cartel would move swiftly to absorb the CJNG's South American partners and trafficking routes. In Colombia, armed groups that had supplied the CJNG faced an uncertain future. In Europe and Asia, where the CJNG had established distribution networks for cocaine and methamphetamine, rival organizations were already making contact with the cartel's regional managers. For the United States, the political win was enormous. The Trump administration's designation of the CJNG as a foreign terrorist organization in 2025 had been the legal mechanism that supercharged the bilateral intelligence cooperation that made the Tapalpa operation possible. The White House claimed credit. The DEA claimed credit. U.S. diplomats declared it a validation of their aggressive posture on cartel terrorism. But former DEA official Mike Vigil, a veteran of the cartel wars, said what the veterans always say after a kingpin falls: El Mencho controlled everything like a dictator of a country. His absence could slow the cartel's rapid growth initially, but there were dozens of regional commanders now positioned to fight for control. The coming weeks would determine whether the CJNG held together under El Pelon's uncertain leadership or fractured into smaller, even more unpredictable factions, each one potentially more willing to use extreme violence to establish dominance. History offered no comfort. Pablo Escobar's death did not end cocaine. El Chapo's arrest did not end the Sinaloa. The CJNG had been built to survive its founder. The question was how much blood the survival would cost. For the ordinary people of Mexico, the vendors, teachers, mothers, and children who had spent years living in the shadow of CJNG violence, the feeling was complicated. Relief that the man who had ordered so much death was finally dead. Fear that what came next might be worse. And the bone-deep exhaustion of a country that had watched this story play out before and knew that it never truly ended. In Tapalpa, residents spoke in whispers in the days after. Some refused to speak at all. The mountains still belonged to the cartel. El Mencho's men still controlled the roads. The succession war had not yet chosen a winner. The ghost was dead. The war was not. Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, the Lord of the Roosters, the ghost of Jalisco. Born July 17, 1966, in the hills of Michoacán. Died February 22, 2026, in the mountains above Tapalpa, Jalisco. The ghost who finally bled, found hiding in the trees. The most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere had met the one enemy that no amount of money, loyalty, or silence could defeat. Justice, slow, brutal, and imperfect, had found him in the end. But as the fires went dark across 20 Mexican states, and as the cartel commanders sharpened their knives in the quiet of their fortified compounds, one truth remained, as permanent and unmoved as the mountains of Jalisco themselves. The empire did not die with the emperor.